Yeah, absolutely. Well, so, having started on the marketing side, a lot of people want to have that check mark, particularly in marketing departments. So the way marketing departments have agencies, they would use someone like us for the innovation group, if you will, right? So in the early days, it was, how do I get press, right? But as we realized going through the process, we were basically setting ourselves up for failure anytime we would take a client that didn't have data, right? So Martin's echoed it, Meg's echoed it, you have too, without a core base of data. So oftentimes when we talk about the integration into the business process, it's do you have data? If you don't, is part of this initiative to collect data, which is absolutely legitimate and important and will absolutely supercharge a lot of the business processes that are left in front of us. An example might be Getty Images, right? They had all of this consumer data, not just the metadata of the images. And how were they going to leverage that, use that, besides building a chat bot that could respond to, written descriptions of words? The second thing is trust with their customers. So a lot of times, if they were not, a lot of the brand building exercises were super important in what we did. Not that we were the marketing agency to do that, but in order for it to be integrated into their business process and be thoughtful about it, there had to be that base of trust, right? And then the third thing was really about how do we work with the people who can say, the things that you guys are coming up with, particularly what the models are outputting. I'm speaking specifically of artificial intelligence here, right? Not so much just conversational UI.
Right.
Are they actually outputting things that make sense, right? Like that's not realistic behavior. So that was a little more of the implementation process. I think in the decision-making process, we always force them to go through a prototype, like discovery and prototype phase with us. So, and then there's always this long gap when we build the business case with them, because I think that transition to really implementing conversational UI or AI has to be something that that isn't just coming from design or marketing. One of the things for Comcast, for example, is we prototype for them the different ways that machine learning could be helpful to their interface business for their for programming, right? Like the cable guides, right? And he turned to me and said, that's great, Becky, but I don't think you've really made a business case for why I need individualized data, because my advertisers really only need household level data. Why? And I said, you need to be thoughtful about future-proofing, because you're not going to have this business in 10 years, right? So can we imagine a possibility where 5 years from now, you're the go-to IoT provider of data, if you will, for all entertainment preferences? That's aspirational, right? But for us to get there, what are you willing to do? So you have to step outside of, am I going to save money? That's very important. Am I going to make customers happy? Even more important is your business going to be shock-proof from the evolutions that are happening?
That's very interesting. I also hope from a cable perspective, Comcast isn't around that business model.
With that business model, right.
Exactly. Interesting. Okay, so Meg, how about you? How is Intel, and companies that maybe Intel works with, thinking about AI, how to integrate this into their business planning process?
So Intel, we tend to take a very democratic approach to what AI means for our partners. We're certainly in the business of bringing up CPUs, ASICs, FPGAs, connectivity. We're a nuts and bolts company. So we certainly feel passionately about AI, but AI, we believe, is an aspirational state and it's an iterative state. That said, what we're finding, at least what I'm finding, and I think some of the folks in my cohort are finding, is that partners we're talking to, whether it's Visa or MasterCard or others like that, is help us build the ecosystem and the framework to get to an end state that's sustainable for AI. Help us touch our customers and partners and help us build the plumbing, or help us build the guidance on what kind of plumbing architecture we need to get to that next level, right? We're nuts and bolts shops, we're plumbers. So we help our partners build the plumbing for their end customers. That's what I do really at an end level. Many of the end customers are certainly in the financial and payment world, and ultimately the payment world, from what we're seeing, tends to fall into 3 or 4 buckets. One giant bucket is around risk. The second giant bucket is around engagement and enablement, so making sure that the products and services that the customers want, customers meaning end users want, is positioned there. The third is don't over AI us, if that makes any sense. So the term AI, I tend to use it lightly because AI means tell me what workload you'd like to fall into. Is it machine learning? Is it deep learning? Are you mining regulatory data, or are you mining data that is on a GPU for image recognition for blah, blah, blah use case, right? So usually it's about what are you trying to simplify, how are you trying to simplify it, and what are you trying to accelerate such that the end user is having an easier experience. That's ultimately where we tend to think. And then where do we obviously, we want to position our compute there to help make that workflow easier.
Interesting. So you're seeing demand more on how can we simplify things using AI, and that's how you diagnose your clients and your partners' needs. And you're hearing more, of the how do we engage our customers, how do we future-proof our business, and those sorts of things. So just a wide swath of use cases that that AI can actually apply to.
I should say that also Intel, we have invested in 4 major AI acquisitions. We've invested in a company called Nirvana, which is an ASIC company, and we have our own software framework, hardware framework. These are all low-level plumbing. We also have FPGAs, which are accelerators, co-processors. We also have our classic CPUs and families that are workload specialized for AI. And then we have different engines for inference, training, scoring, et cetera, whatever workload is needed. So we have specialized product inventories for that use case workload.
Okay.
So we do have them.
Interesting. Okay, maybe moving on to our next question. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on the use cases you've seen work in your side of the business, more the design and advertising. I know we've talked a lot about technology and payments and commerce, and very adjacent but close to that is advertising. So chatbots you've experimented with, excellent. So what else is resonating on that side of the house?
It's interesting, as we've grown as a business, one of the things we found is that you look at your customer base who comes to you, right? And we often have media companies come to us, like big ones, small ones, who say, distributors like Facebook, Amazon, and I use the term distributor of content loosely, right? They're eating our lunch, what do I do, right? And so a lot of times we kind of fall back to our 3 C's of content, commerce, community, which is really what the point of media has been and has been in the early days. And obviously when Craigslist came out and sort of disrupted the classifieds model, there wasn't a business model there, right? So in many ways they've had to go back and be their own type of retail company or supporting retail companies that way. Supporting community, how do you get people to come together? And then obviously the content piece, which so few of the media companies who we know have been super successful at it, right? So what we found is that for sure chatbots are a challenge, right? Because at the end of the day, we found that the biggest challenge is actually the integration of the data, right? What we find is when we are able to model what might be interesting potential behavioral patterns, what we find is we don't have the right motivational patterns, right? And so we rely on advertising techniques of surveys to figure those things out, right? So as a practitioner, obviously I'm not the engineer in my company, but as a practitioner and really a higher level strategist, we find that things like recommendation engines we can figure out pretty well, right? Like we can recommend things on a generalized level for media companies, right? Of course, a lot of that has already been systemized with Outbrain or things like, or Taboola, right? So we find that like when someone has created a company around it and they give us a toolkit, it's amazing. Now, I'm not saying that that's all we do, but it is a good way for us to say, okay, this piece of technology has matured, and really that they're looking for, we're plumbers in another sense, but we tend to work on maybe startups that say, okay, but I want to tackle the industry at large. If I were to start today, what would that look like, right? And it's almost those suburbanized tools that have been solved for 80% that are just fine to start with, right? So recommendation engines, easy, right? But we participate in that too. So a great example is a company called Architizer, who wanted to build essentially an architecture genome. And the reason they wanted to do that is because their community is a community of architects and contractors, right? And so they weren't able to successfully master the recommendation of additional products to the contractors. Because they weren't able to say this piece of plaster goes really well with this, this particular doorknob, because it doesn't understand the different styles through the years that the architect is trying to envision, right? So we were able to use a lot of existing libraries, do some very use sort of the talent of architecture firms and architecture schools actually more closely to describe those things. And what we found was, wow, a lot of styles of architecture are actually intimately related to one another. So it's never just one style. Right. So recommendation is something we think is, machine learning, and to the extent that it's not, in the early days it was easy to be rule-based, right? Keynotes, do this and that, but we do feel like, for example, Clarify has been a great technology that we've implemented and used. We've used Watson to varying degrees of success. Sorry, IBM. So I think recommendation has been done really well.